All right, welcome to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. Today, it's not our normal recording day, but Sunday school is getting too difficult because weekends are too busy, so we're doing Wednesday night service instead.
Yeah, and we might do social and service just because I have jury
Ugh.
duty, and every day at 6 o'clock p.m. for those that have done it, you have to check in and make sure you don't have to report the next day. So we're kind of playing things day to day as well.
Yeah.
And if you want to get things started on meta philosophy, we can go into why I adhere to jury duty, even though you can technically throw the damn thing away. Do you want to start with that, or do you want to go into the
No,
old
let's
book first?
let's start with that.
Okay, so rule following. We talked about this in our book series because we have a character named Galad who is the ultimate rule follower, and we are both intrigued by his storyline because he morally and ethically comes into the face of how rule following isn't always good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he's still torn because he grew up where rule following was the essence of being good. So it's actually a very interesting character arc once you parse out the details. Well, personally, I try to be consistent, and uh, I don't follow all the rules. I don't follow all the laws. Hopefully, saying it on the air doesn't get me arrested. But a good example is speed limits, right? So it's an example we can all kind of identify with because we all kind of hate them and like them at the same time under the surface. If there was no speed limit, everybody would be driving willy-nilly and we would have never adapted to a comfort zone. So you would have people, going 100 down the freeway and people going 30, and it would be chaos. So they do exist for a reason, but at the same time, it's not something almost any of us follow to the letter of the law. And when I'm talking about my own self, I look at the spirit of the law. It's a common term, a little bit overused, but we look at the spirit of the law. So the spirit of the law for a speed limit is safety. And when I'm driving down the residential areas in front of me that I'm looking out a window at right now, I go the speed limit because we have kids at play. We have people walking their dogs. We have cars pulling out of driveways. And that speed limit actually is very, very, very much there for a reason because reaction time is not as good as you would like to think you are, especially you teenagers driving your F-150s down the road. You are not experienced and you do not have the reaction time you think you do. And the other part is judgment. So if I see that stop sign down the block and I'm backing out of my drive and it's empty, then I can assume by the speed limit that I have time to pull out and go. Whereas if I see it empty and someone blows through and goes, 20 over the speed limit, that look versus the time I'm actually pulling out can actually be a false sense of security. And I could pull out right into you. So it's for everybody's safety. Now on the freeway, going I-10 towards San Antonio, it's 75 miles an hour, but we're probably driving about 85 or 90 because the flow of traffic is going 85 or 90. It's actually more dangerous to be a speed Nazi and slow down to 75 and force people to go that speed than it is to go with the flow of traffic. So there, in one case, I break the law. In the other case, I follow the law to the letter. But because the nature behind it is actually safety on the road, I'm okay with that. Now we go to jury duty, another gray area, right? You get sent this thing in the mail, and a lot of people get scared. Oh my God, if I don't show up, I'm going to be arrested. But guess what? They can't prove you got it. You could be at a new address. You could be. It could have got lost in the mail. Some kid could be stealing mail out of mailboxes. Nobody knows. Nobody knows if you actually got it until they start sending these things certified mail. Nobody knows you actually got it. So you could just rip it up and never go. But once you register and you show up, you're locked in. But I have no problem doing that because I appreciate that we have trial by jury in the United States of America. And frankly, just like my rule of, when someone sees a spider, I take it outside instead of squashing it. Because if I'm ever caught in a situation where I am out of place, I hope somebody guides me to the right place before they squash me. Same thing with jury duty. I would prefer someone showing up knowing it's their civic duty in that stand if I'm ever in a courtroom, because I plan on being innocent if I ever am.
Mm-hmm.
And not only someone who's willing to show up for their civic duty is also probably someone who adheres to innocent until proven guilty. Better 10 to go free than one innocent to go to jail. Those principles that our legal system is actually based upon. And so my belief in that system, morally, I have to do it, even though I have clients that are like, oh my gosh, you just tear it up and you don't have to interrupt our training sessions or any of that. It's like, no, I got to do this because, yeah, I could get away with it, but I would also be doing the wrong thing to begin. Now, we can debate about that. I'm never going to make anybody go, because making somebody go actually gets the person I don't want to be there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the person that's going to vote you guilty just so they don't have to stay there longer. Versus someone who has the right mindset going into it is going to hang a jury if they think that person is possibly innocent, or at least has a reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the I think we've talked about this before, the same idea of you can just sit at home or sit online and bitch and moan all the time. When was the last time you went to a school board meeting? Or the ones here now uh are streamed, so you can just tune in. You don't even have to go. You can tune in so you at least know what's going on. But if there is something going on that you object to, do you bitch about it, or do you show up and actually say something?
Or an HOA meeting.
Hmm.
That's another one that most of us, we bitch and moan about our HOAs, but when's the last time you went to a meeting? The guy walks around the lake behind our house. So these HOAs, they hire new management companies like every year pretty much. And every time a new one comes in, they basically revisit every violation they think is there, even though it's been resolved, without checking the records. And finally, one guy, because some of us have add-on hot tubs or first world problems, but still violating the HOA unless you have your permit or whatever, and you have to go back through the histories and hope everybody kept perfect records, which unfortunately these management companies actually don't keep the records of the things they resolve. But here nor there. Well, he got tired of it because he had to deal with it every time this had to come through. And apparently the people who had our house before us had to, because we were having to every time with that add-on hot tub that's out there. So he just joined the HOA architect committee and got voted in. And so as the HOA architecture manager, he's just like, okay, everybody just give me all your stuff. And anytime some of this pops up, we'll just check down the line because we're tired of it. And there you go. That's exactly what you're talking about. Don't bitch about it. Do something. And to his surprise, it takes very little time off his hands because it's about 30 people that have the same issue over and over and over again. So you just look at the same exact 30 things every year. That's not that long.
Less time to actually do something about it than to deal with the headache constantly.
Oh, constantly. Ours is pretty bad too. And I've seen the lady. I've seen her in her car. She's got like 3, like, you know how the cops have a laptop right here? She's got like a triple screen.
Jeez.
And I saw her pull up and a car was semi-illegally parked. And she was typing all these things on her phone and then leaves a note on the car. And I was like, I know who you are now. I see you. We were doing that front landscaping, and I have buckets are useful. I've told you how useful buckets are, and I was hauling rocks around in buckets. I had left a bucket up one day in front of the garage door, and I got a notice because I had a bucket sitting in front of my garage door. They called it trash. Exposed trash is what they called it. That was a pretty damn good bucket, by the way. It wasn't trash. Unless that handle is falling off, no bucket is trash. Keep your buckets, man. But I thought that was a nice little philosophical intro, since we're talking about morals and ethics and
Hmm.
the basis of what it is to be human and live in this universe. But that's what I try to that's what I try to adhere to when it comes to following rules and laws. Again, it gives me that moral high ground a little bit when I have to break a law. And some people would say, "Oh, well, it's subjective." No, as long as I follow the same pattern, it's not subjective.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, which is another reason why if you are ethically minded and have strong adherence to principles, you would want to show up for jury duty and hope people like you show up for jury duty, because one of the points and really obligations of a jury of your peers is that we can ultimately nullify bad, improper, unjust laws,
Mm-hmm.
because
It's a thing
you
called precedent. These
yeah.
cases are how it kind of works itself out. A law is written, but there's so many ways it can be
Mhm.
interpreted. And then when cases come forward, it's how the
It,
rulings go forward.
it's one of the so one of the things that annoy me are jury instructions, and lawyers fight over this when it comes time for the jury instructions, because the jury's supposed to be locked into those jury to that. Well, if if what you're trying to decide you truly believe is unjust, then no, you don't have to lock yourself into, no, you must only decide based on this narrow structure of the law. Well, no, because then you're going to force me to do something unjust just to adhere to the letter of the law. That's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you have a jury of thinking people, of your peers, not, in other places, um, like in appellate courts, it's a panel of judges. You don't want you might want that if you're trying to decide on the merits of the law, of defining what the law means. But when a citizen is uh having his life, liberty, or property threatened by the state, you don't want a panel of judges. You don't want a panel of experts. You want his fellow citizens sitting there deciding, is this just? Is this right?
Well, and I would even prefer if it was a little more blind than it is. If you can, other than it's not, you're not capable of doing it in every situation. Like if a defendant takes the stand, obviously
Mm-hmm.
this is a situation where you have to be able to see the person. But I would prefer if the jury is blind to who's being defended and all we get is the facts of the case. Because what if I look over and I see the defendant in some criminal case, some property damage case, and they've got a swastika on her neck, right? Immediately, I'm going to be like, this person's better off not on the street. I've already made my decision partially, and that's going to influence what happens in the case. But the case needs to be, is this person guilty of this crime?
Mm-hmm.
And so my judgment of the person as an individual, yeah, he obviously has moral issues. If he's got this symbol on his neck, not only is it a symbol that exemplifies something, but he put it out where everybody can see it. But did he commit this crime? Does his internal thoughts match the physical implications? And that's the way the justice system has to be. I can't say, well, this person's obviously disturbed and they're probably going to be a problem at some time, so we should lock them up.
Mm-hmm.
Versus, did they actually commit the crime they're being accused of? And I wish we could be a little more blind of that. It's not, again, not always possible, not always practical, but if we could do it more often. How many times do you see, oh, this person showed no remorse? Well, maybe they're not faking it. Maybe they're not a narcissistic personality that knows how to get away with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know that. We don't know if they are. We don't know if they aren't. So what are the merits of the case? My looking at this person and saying, oh, they look smug, should have nothing to do with whether they're guilty or not. Now, again, on the stand, we need to see their body mannerisms. We need to see their facial expressions because as humans, we read facial expressions very well when we're talking to people. So we can kind of get a feel if they're lying or not.
Mhm.
There is that. But at the same time, just being able to see who they are should be blind until it's absolutely needed.
Yeah, that's a thought I hadn't really considered, but yeah, that that seems like something that would make a lot of sense.
Well,
Uh,
that would also destroy the whole social justice argument. I wouldn't know whether
true.
they're black, white, or indifferent if I never got to see them.
Yeah. Yeah, also a good point.
But again, unless it's relevant to the case, eyewitness that describes the person and it happens to look exactly like the person, obviously jury needs to see that. But other than that, fingerprints in the scene, stuff like that. But yeah, let's get on to the meta part of this though.
All right, I will do my best, but woke up in the middle of the night with my neck hurting and a headache, and it never went away. So, I'm not feeling great, and it hurts to read. But, uh, I've been teasing this couple weeks now, where we left off, with Sarna.
Do you
And
remember which version you wanted me to have? The English Standard or the New King James?
New King James is the one I've
Okay. I just want to
been
stay
told by
consistent so we're not arguing
several
different
people.
points. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and there's only, one this section really kind of revolves all around just one small phrase in the Genesis account. We'll get deeper into the text next time when we jump to the Garden of Eden, because it there's a lot of um there's a lot about human existence and humanity and human nature in the Garden of Eden story. Um, so we'll dive more to that here, but just setting the stage still of the creation story. And this section in is Sarna titles Mythology, Magic, and God's Freedom. And this is something we kind of went round and round with a couple of times. The idea that, well, prayer is a kind of magic. Not in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Well,
It's
of course,
it's
because they set the definition.
no, I mean it is objectively different from magical ritual of pagan pantheons. And here's how Sarna explains it. First, by setting the stage that kind of mentioned last time, that there is no, while there is a creation myth for the creation of the world, there is no creation myth for God Yahweh. It God just is. Um, down the road when we get to uh the account of Moses, you know, who shall I say sent me? I am, is how God names himself. He simply is. Um, Contrast that with, the Greek pantheon is what most people know. So the creation of Zeus from the Titans, and how all of that came into being. Well, if even the head of a pantheon is a created being, and the stories of the gods depict their personal lives with all the struggles and emotions of a regular old man, um, then, to quote Sarna, then they can have neither freedom nor omnipotence. The birth of the gods implies the existence of some primordial self-contained realm from which the gods themselves derive. Since, according to pagan concepts, man's destiny is controlled by two separate forces, the gods and the powers beyond the gods, it was inevitable that magic became an integral part of pagan religion. Man had to be able to devise the means of activating those forces superior even to the gods. religion as a consequence became increasingly concerned with the elaboration of ritual designed to propitiate the numerous unpredictable powers that be. I'll pause there for a moment to see what you think of the way he's defining magic and ritual.
Again, I think it's a distinction without a difference. He's speaking to invoking deities that have some source, whereas the act of prayer is an invocation. It's just like you use the word cutting out the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
It's still an invocation. And there's a separate topic attached to that because it did come up in that little dissertation with omnipotence versus good and evil, and again, these incomplete things, which are the deities of pagan religions, versus the one true God, right? So that's the difference. Except the act of invoking is there's no difference there. It's just you're asking the source, or you're asking a manager of the source. I don't see the difference there. It's still an invocation.
Well, there's a big difference because it is distinctly different. That there are not two separate sources in the Judeo-Christian religion. There is not the gods and the powers above the gods as what is it? How is it that he says the powers beyond the gods? You know, the realm from which the gods themselves were created. So it's not just you know, there are sacrifices and rituals and, you know, things that you would do in the temple to Hera, but even more than that, beyond that and separate from that, there would be magic, the point of which was to um gain control or use of this other power, because they're both of these things are impacting you know, human life. So it's not just, you know, um you know, I need to make a sacrifice to Poseidon before I go on this voyage because he is the god of the sea, but
I can make this
there are
sacrifice and
also,
I can gain control of the sea.
yes,
This is
I can
that's the difference.
I can perform this, I can perform this magical ritual. I can, if I have this magical power, then I also can control, you know, this primordial force that that even has that is separate from Poseidon. And there, because there is no origin story of God the Creator, there is no separation. And so there is no point for magic in that sense.
Okay, so again, a, a distinction without a difference, and this is where language
Mhm.
comes in. And language is limited. I will be 100% consistent in knowing that. But what I'm speaking of is an invocation, which we have the number one definition for that, which I think is consistent whether you're petitioning to God or petitioning to Zeus and Poseidon. It's still an invocation. But what you're doing is you're taking the step towards incantation,
Mm-hmm.
which is another step. Did they switch?
Yeah.
Yeah. A use of spells or verbal charms spoken as a ritual of magic. So an incantation is a more of a direct effect, right? Where an invocation is a call to authority for assistance, realistically.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both present in both of the pagan religions and the especially the Judeo-Christian Old Testament religion. That's where I think, yes, there was a step taken in having the middleman taken out, but at the same time, you're still invoking
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
but see, that's where there is a distinction and there is a difference. Is what Sarna is saying is in in the traditional pagan religions throughout the world, there is both, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's a good way to differentiate. There is both invocation and incantation. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is only invocation.
except for the butchered versions of that. But that's, I think that's part of your point of doing this is we're going to try to eliminate the butchered versions. But, you know, like blessing you with the holy cistern or something, you know, holy water would be an example of incantation, right? There's nothing holy about the water you dip your hand in and then make the cross on your head. It's,
It was a primary point of contention that created the
mhm.
Reformation.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I know that's one reason, one thing you're trying to make a distinction here with our discussions.
mhm,
So I will be upfront that I know there's a difference between that. You know, what was the indulgences?
mhm.
Indulgences would be an incantation, right? Because you paid money to somebody as a middleman to basically cleanse your sins.
That's actually a really good way to frame it. Because you know, we know a little bit about uh, Chinese mysticism. Uh, just from the cheesy old kung fu movies we used to watch, as
Mm-hmm.
well as just some reading and stuff. And that was part of the mysticism is you could pay a sorcerer or a medium of some sort, and they would write the spells on strips of paper, and you would carry that with you so that
Mm-hmm.
you would have that as a kind of talisman. And I haven't really thought of it before, but that's basically what you're getting when you buy the indulgence.
For those that want a great cheesy kung fu theater, spiritual kung fu with Jackie Chan, where
Mm.
they would take those things and then stick them on their head, and then they can all of a sudden see the ghosts. There's a good one for you if you want great kung fu theater.
It's a classic.
That is a
Um,
classic. I do have a burned DVD version of that, so I might have to watch that tonight. Uh, but no, I do want to separate that, but I still think first of all, there's elements of that that have leaked through and have carried over because again, to me, and this is the thesis I have going forward in our discussions, is this is an evolution of religion. It isn't something new like you're kind of positing, and the newness being a form of evidence that it is something to be more taken seriously. It's an evolution. And again, back to our previous discussions, it's an evolution based on technological advancement, realistically, which I used agriculture, but in a lot of ways, technological advancement. The more we understood about the world, the more abstract we had to make God, i.e., in the context of what we're talking about now, the more I have to make it an invocation versus people know I can't shoot lightning bolts from my finger, no matter what little minute evidences I can show to scare people with little parlor tricks that I know. So we've reached a point where we understand I can't shoot lightning bolts from my fingers. So I have to shift the influence to be more of an invocation in the form of something like a sacrifice and a prayer where things may work out. And if they don't, I can always say, your sacrifice wasn't good enough, as we're going to get to a story here
mhm.
in the short term. So did I frame things well for you to kind of bring in your argument?
Yeah, I think so. And not going down the rabbit trail of the evolution again, because we've already gone back and forth with that a little bit. But there is a um you kind of sparked a thought when you were talking about that of the abstract, the idea of making God more abstract. This is the creation story is setting up the uh the more tangible parts of the religion of the Jewish law that is going to come in Exodus. That you can kind of draw you can draw a straight line there. That wouldn't really work if you didn't have this kind of omnipotent creator being. That the Ten Commandments work because of what God is, what the God of Genesis is.
8 of the 10 commandments work because of the reality of living in the real world. Thou shalt not, except for thou shalt not worship any God but me. And what was the second one?
Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy.
Yeah, exactly. So those two. And even that one I can kind of indirectly give physical justification for. The first one is the only one that has no justification in the real world. And if you want to, if for those in the audience want to use that as evidence of supreme being, then yes, that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable to me, because obviously more people believe than don't believe. But other than that, all of the 8 of the 10 all have social altruism at its base. And the Sabbath one, I can even put, if you wanted me to make a semi-weak argument about how important rest is in being productive in your daily life, especially in farming and agriculture, then yes, we could go down that hole. But again, I think it's an evolution based on what was going on, and we're mistaking things written as if they were written spontaneously versus things that were written from wise words over time. The Farmer's Almanac is still more accurate than your meteorologist. Right.
It's still what I use to plant by.
Mm-hmm.
They're high tech now. The Farmer's Almanac has a website. You go in, you put in your zip code, and they say, okay, here are your best planting days by produce. This is when you want to plant what. And it works for me. I just wish it could keep the freaking bugs away. Okay, back to Sarna to wrap this up.
Yeah, keep going, because it is a different take, and I've had many a debate with the standard Christian take, and that's Catholic, my most experienced Catholic, Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, and the evangelicals. So those are the 4 that mostly I've talked to. So I'm trying to get a different take on this, because if I can't justify it even under unknowns, then I need to rethink my position. That's just how science works. That's how life works. So,
all right. So back to quoting directly from Sarna. Anyone who reads the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Psalms, is aware that the ancient Israelite was as struck by the majesty of the natural phenomena as was any of his pagan neighbors. But unlike them, he did not profess to see God within these phenomena. The clear line of demarcation between God and his creation was never violated. Nowhere is this brought out more forcefully than in the Hebrew Genesis account. Here we find no physical link between the world of humanity and the world of divine. There is no natural connection between the creator and his handiwork. Hence, there is no room for magic in the religion of the Bible. The God of creation is eternally existent, removed from all corporeality, that's a hard word to say, and independent of time and space. Creation comes about through the simple divine fiat, let there be. And I said that's the text in the Bible was going to be very small, and that's it. Is that through each stage of creation, it is simply spoken into existence. Let there be. That God decrees and it is done. Contrasted with I think I mentioned last time one of the oldest Near Eastern Mesopotamian creation myths is I think it's called the Enuma Elish. It's if you're a nerd, you may know you may know the dragon Tiamat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that comes from. And so what he's talking about the no physical link. So in a lot of these creation myths, uh, the 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 land was created from the body of slain Tiamat, and like the oceans were her blood, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That there's this substance that uh that the gods used, the gods in this instance who slew Tiamat. There's this substance that they use to create the world, like uh uh like a builder would create a building of, the builder doesn't just snap it in, speak it into existence. He has to go gather, you know, the clay, turn it into brick, and then start building. And that follows with the various creation myths of the various pagan religions uh, throughout history, and especially at this time. Uh,
Okay, so I know it's going to go deeper than this, but let me give the outsider's look, the outsider's perspective here. The immediate thought that would come to somebody's head is, what's the difference between that and this is the blood of Christ, this is the body of Jesus?
mhm.
Because you just said this thing that is obviously a metaphor for the things that were created, and you're saying Christianity's not like that, but then we have this metaphor for this path to the eternal. So that, we don't need to go down there. I'm just throwing that
Right.
out there.
Well,
That's a
that's
perspective that again, when we got to one of the things that I have trouble with these arguments is, or these debates, is the bounce back and forth between the literal and the metaphor.
mhm.
And there are metaphors in the church, and that you can't say, well, this is different because we don't do this, but you do, you just do it in a different way. And I think that's something that has to be addressed as we go forward as well.
Mhm. Well, that's why I think you really hit on something with invocation and incantation, because to to quickly answer, there wouldn't be a difference if you're making it an incantation. There wouldn't be. It would be the
Well, I
same
guess, yeah, you got
as
ahead
other
of me there,
things.
because I didn't want to bring it up till this
Mhm.
exact thing popped up. Was things like the communion and confirmations and baptisms are incantations. They're symbolic, but in a sense, all incantations are symbolic. When you're an incantation is an invocation that has a process, a ritual that is supposed to have an immediate effect. Baptism, you're cleansed from your sins. You've made this decision, you've made it public. This person who is an authority helps you through the process, and when you come back up from the water, you're purified of your sins, and we start from square one. Whole purpose of baptism. We're all born flawed. We will be flawed, but now I can start from square one. And that to me is an incantation. I mean, it's a metaphysical incantation, because we can't define sins, right? Your soul being cleansed. But theoretically, if there was a thing of the soul, which is an argument of Christianity, and it is cleansed at that moment, that's an incantation.
My thought is that yes and no. Yes, it can be an incantation, but that is where it is dependent on the person. It is dependent on how what your mindset is and how you view, you know, baptism or communion or whatever. Uh,
Well, no, it's dependent on the existence of a soul, because everything is dependent on the person. If I am, if I want to be a wizard and magic actually exists, I still have to have the right stuff to be a wizard to incant the magic. Whereas if a soul exists and I can cleanse it through this process, and I, as a person, am 100% mentally willing to do it, which is the process, right? I am bought in. I am giving myself up. I am sacrificing the me that was to the me that will be, then I still go through this process. And if the soul is real, then it is something that does something. If the soul is not real, it does nothing except in the physical world. And that's the difference. So if the soul is real, then it's an incantation because it actually did something. If the soul is not real, then it is not an incantation because realistically, all it is me just changing my decisions from here on out.
No, because not all rectangles are squares. Not all rituals are necessarily magic, are necessarily an incantation.
They are if they do something. They have an immediate effect.
So,
So if it actually cleansed the soul, then yes, it's an incantation. If it is an invocation to cause me to be a better person for the rest of my life, then no. So again, it hinges on the fact that a soul exists and it can be cleansed in this way. Again, this is why we can't bounce back and forth between literal and metaphor. If a soul exists, it's literal.
mhm.
If a soul is a manifestation of your decisions going forward and your presence in this world, metaphor, then it is not. So if we're speaking metaphorically, it is not an incantation. If we're speaking literally, it cleanses your soul, which is a thing that exists, zygote crowd, when we get to the abortion debate, then yes, it's an incantation because we can't think of just the physical world. The physical world isn't the only world that exists
So,
at this point.
so my warm-up routine is a magic ritual.
Yeah, it has that effect. It is an incantation, yes. It changes the effect of what you're doing. Now it's no, well, okay, so here's where it is different because it is not calling on a higher power. Remember the
Mhm.
definition here. Again, definitions are limited, but there is prayer,
Yeah.
entreaty, or worship. So it's not just the ritual that makes it an incantation. It is the fact that it is adhering to, or gosh, what's the word? Calling on something metaphysical to do so. So your warm-up routine is not, unless you don't believe in all the cellular processes that happen along the way. But it is not, because there are physical things you are doing to yourself that make the desired result happen better. Whereas if part of your warm-up routine was, Jesus, take the wheel on these deadlifts. Without you, I can't lift 500 pounds. Then yes, it is an incantation. If you pray to lift 500 pounds and you go out and for some reason you're able to lift 500 pounds, even though you never did it in your entire life, that's an incantation. Now, I can take you down the physiological effects where neural inhibition went away because of your belief.
Mhm.
But at the same time, that would be a better example of an incantation. If there was no way possible you could lift it and all of a sudden you did because you prayed, that's an incantation. This is actually one of my evolutions towards the path that I've gone down. It was actually, remember your dad's surgery
Mhm.
where we were all sitting there in the waiting room, and right before the surgery happened, the doctor came out and everybody blessed his hands. A big long prayer was said and they blessed his hands, and then when the surgery was successful, everybody praised God. And this was right on the cusp of where I was starting to rethink things, and I hadn't gone through the full process yet, but there was that thought in the back of my head that said, how about med school? How about residency? How about he's probably done this hundreds of times before? That didn't sit well with me, and that kind of started this whole thought process, because if they blessed his hands and that was the reason for success, that's an incantation. If it was not the reason for his success, then it was not an incantation. It was an invocation. If you took some rando off the street and said, "Pray, please God, help him do this surgery," and he went and performed it successfully, I would call that a miracle. and I would believe. But you're not going to do that, and nobody's going to take that chance. I know you've got an answer in your head somewhere, and I'm going to let you get to while you're gathering it. I'm going to give the audience here. This is actually, if you were a believer and you have a nice sit down discussion with me, I think you're a true believer because I'm going to challenge you in every way possible because I have challenged myself in every way possible.
Well,
In fact, if Satan existed, he probably would be me. I don't think I am. I don't believe in it. So, but also if he existed, he would make sure I didn't believe in it. So if you want your, your own self-fulfilled mentality, that there you go. But I think I'm a good person, but if Satan existed, he would be someone like myself.
well, couple thoughts. First of all, I think we should kind of uh, set the stage for why we're having this discussion in the first place. Because, or at least why I am, that this matters, and I kind of talked about this when I talked about, okay, when I was thinking about where do we start, and it occurred to me that we start at the beginning, because to a lot of people, the edgy atheist crowd, Christianity or any form of religion, it is immediately dismissible because it's nonsense. Because it's not any different than spiritual kung fu. That what's happening, what's happening there is exactly what happens when somebody goes to church Sunday morning. They are the exact same, and it's all nonsense. And my point is they are not the exact same. That's Sarna's point here, and he goes through, he lays it out by giving the specific examples of this is what pagan religions are like. Is there's invocation and incantation. Here's why there is incantation, and with the distinct difference in the Genesis story, there is no room for incantation, and that matters. There is a difference there. There is to your point, you kind of touched on earlier that um to some, the continued existence of the Judeo-Christian belief for so long, for millennia, even through persecution, is sign of its divine inspiration. You could also look at it as and this is kind of one of Berlinski's points, if we ever dive into his book The Devil's Delusion, is that he's a secular Jew, he's a non-believer, but he can look at the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, the Christian tradition, and say, no, intellectually there's something of substance there, and that is why it has persisted through centuries and millennia, is that it's not just fanciful nonsense.
Well, and I think if I could talk to somebody like Berlinski, it would be different than his book because I believe that you just said too. There is something of substance to it. But here's the hang up for him, and I think this is where we would identify, and if he's not in a confrontational manner, it would very much show through. He's a secular Jew. He's a non-believer, which means he does not even believe all his own argument.
Not necessarily. I don't.
No, he believes his argument that there is something to this that we should pay attention to, but not that it means that is true. If he thought even the slightest that there was truth behind it in the metaphysical sense, in the you could go to hell for not believing sense, he would be a believer, not a secular.
See, but I don't take that from his book, that it's not a contradiction, because what he's saying is there is there is philosophical substance to these traditions, to these theologies, and it could also be metaphysically true. What the main thrust of his book to me is you cannot dismiss it outright. You cannot prove scientifically that it's not possible that this was that the universe was created because God, the creator of Genesis, spoke it into being. It could be. I Berlinski, as a secular Jew, don't believe that that is true, but I also don't think you can prove that it's not. You have
Well,
to acknowledge the possibility.
I've said that from the beginning. You cannot disprove what you can't prove to begin with, which is the magic behind what you've discussed from the beginning, that it's not not sourced in nature. It's not sourced in something we can see, taste, feel, touch, hear, any of that. It's sourced in the supernatural. It's sourced in the place that we can never go except possibly by the text after we've passed away. So no one ever knows except those that can't tell us.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it could be true, but if I had any inkling of and again, things that carry over to real life aren't evidence. Things that are real life are evidence. Things that we could have learned over time, irrespective of this, are not evidence. And that's, I think, the nature of the conversation. And that's where Berlinski was coming from. He's trying to make the best argument for without actually believing in it himself. And I think at the end of the day, if the ultimate argument, which is actually the best reason why we started from the beginning, because it's the only thing that matters. The beginning is the only thing that matters in this argument. The source of it all, it's still unconvincing. And I would love to see a discussion between him and Sarna or somebody like that, because all I've ever seen is the discussions between him and people that like Dawkins and the Four Horsemen.
Mm-hmm.
I know they ironically gave themselves that name, but I think it's a disservice to themselves. But Dennett, Harris, all of those, Hitchens was probably the most reasonable of them. I've heard him have really good debates, but he was also very much a gentleman.
Yes, yes.
that plays into it. But it's if he was truly convinced with his own arguments, he would no longer be a secular Jew.
See, I disagree because of what you said, that you cannot know. There is no way to prove it. But so there is an element of faith. That's the whole idea of faith, is that at some point you have to take a leap of faith. But that doesn't mean it's a blind leap. You cannot prove or disprove, but you can mount a circumstantial case. Back to where we started here with with jury duty. So, you don't have, a security video of something, so you don't know for sure. You can neither prove nor disprove. So you take different blocks of evidence of, ideas, and you put them together and say, is this convincing to me? And for someone like Berlinski, he can, to your point, steel man someone else's argument, make the best case that they would, and still say, but for me, I don't find it convincing.
Let me take a quick bathroom break, and then when we come back, you and probably Sarna have more in common with the Jehovah's Witness than you probably want to, and we'll start with that as I come back.
Okay, nice tease.
All right, so frequent conversations with the Jehovah's Witness because I see them on a daily basis pretty much. And he's a deacon in his church and very well educated, really smart guy. But he talks about the way they look at the word faith. And they look at the word faith as an evidence-based thing. It's not just blind. And so that's why I said you're probably more in line. Whereas your evangelicals, which would be the other end of the spectrum within Christianity, not the other end, period, but the other end within Christianity, where you got people like my sister who are like, when the sun rises, can't you see him? Well, that would play into it is part of the physical. You know, if the sun rising made me think God existed, then it is no different than the pagan religions. Because what is that different than the sun rises, Apollo exists? So there is no difference there. But the sun rises, all of this thing, because something put it in motion, is a very different kind of way to look at everything. So, but yeah, it is their whole premise on everything, and minute differences on opinion on certain scriptures are probably there, but your argument on faith is actually more in line, where it's an evidence-based thing. Now, I like that we starting from the beginning, because personally, I think the further out we get, the more contradictions there are. Whereas the further we get to the beginning, the more it plays to your argument, which is there's this thing that we can't explain that exists before everything else, which is the Berlinski argument, because that was my complaint about the book, is it always went back to that thing. If you want to explain everything we can't explain by calling it God, then you're right. I cannot argue with you. Or you're wrong, because you can't argue for you. You can only say you can't explain this, so haha.
Well, and again, we interpreted his book very differently because um
Well, because we both have my side bias is what it is.
yeah, that
That's the number one bias in the world, by the way, other than parental family unit, which is probably very much related to my side bias. But
the what I took him to say was, what I was saying, that there are, it's not everything we don't know is God. It's there are plenty of things we don't know and we may never know. We may never be able to explain, which means there is room for a creator God.
But just because there's room doesn't mean it exists.
No, but
that I mean, it's Schrodinger right there. Is the cat or alive or a dead? You don't know, so it could be either.
But he was taking on a very specific idea, the idea that science has or even can disprove the existence of God.
Oh, I've never taken that stance.
And
maybe that's why I read the book differently, because I thought anybody who takes that stance is ridiculous.
Yeah, but you're a big fan of Dawkins.
Yeah, because of the things that we do know, he was a big part of. That's why I'm a big fan of Dawkins.
Yeah,
The Selfish Gene is still one of the best books ever written. Yeah, this side. Yeah, without The Selfish Gene, we don't have many of the things that keep us alive to this day, medically. So, however you want. Now, his arrogance and, I guess, short shrift with religious people. But again, I actually understand him to some degree when he gets that way, because in dealing with the people he deals with the most, which is the loudest people, you do want to be snarky. You do want to be arrogant. You get that feeling because the argument being presented to you is ridiculous. Again, the loudest, the most in your face, the people that show up to shows and his speeches and yell and scream.
Well, that was also, I think, part of Berlinski's point when he brought up oh my gosh, why am I brain farting on his name? You've got his book there behind you. The ancient theologian, the guy who wrote in Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
Um, so and I mentioned this back at when we in our first episode of this when we started out talking about the edgy atheists on YouTube before Atheism Plus and wokeness imploded the atheist movement, which I find hilarious. It
Yeah. Again,
they're
they
they're
added a cross to atheism.
there comes a point though where you're not being intellectually honest if you're, only engaging the weakest of arguments. That these people, some of these YouTube channels I watch, every every episode I watched was the same thing is let's go out and find some, young earther who's going to tell me that the Bible proves the earth is only 6,000 years old and make fun of them. And that's why Berlinski spent a lot of time on Aquinas was to say, you don't have to believe this argument. There are counter arguments, but here's a very solid, well-written argument that's like 1,200 years old.
Well, so there's a simple answer. Again, we go Occam's razor. There's a simple answer to why atheism plus and most of the atheism movement spends most of their time in that realm. They're only capable intellectually of spending most of their time in that realm, which you start with the immediate contradictions, which again, it gets easier as you go further from Genesis because it becomes less and less abstract and more rule based, more the contradictions to nature kind of show up a little bit more. So the further out you get from Genesis, the easier it gets. So they go down as far as they can. Again, the easy target is the Roman Catholic Church because of all the things we have already talked about, or the things we've already talked about, and then all the things like that they did. The easy target is that, but most people aren't intellectually capable of going beyond that. And that's the sad truth. They're just average intellect. Well, this stuck around for a long time because it's beyond average intellect. Where someone like Hitchens, who's not only a scholar but a gentleman at the same time, does a much better job of engaging this discussion. And in fact, the disservice with the devil's delusion is he ad hominem the actual intellectuals as much as the little guys on the other side ad hominem the religious argument. I would love for him to have interviewed Hitchens for the book instead of just taking a blurb from one of his many books and then saying, haha, this is why you're wrong. Or actually, as you're saying, this is why you could be wrong. But again, let's go to where you started, let there be. So again, the further out we get, the more obvious it gets. But let there be, you say there's no physical component to it. But we know now that the people who wrote this part of it didn't know how the earth actually came to being, how water formed, how microorganisms formed, how all of these things came to be. And so there is a physical component. God said, do this. But there was step-by-step processes.
There's a physical, see,
the Big Bang hypothesis, I hate to call it theory because it is still a hypothesis, is one thing, but how the earth formed, we actually kind of figured that part out. And so this is in the very first thing is light, which is the first thing in everything, even if you go back to Einstein. And Schrodinger did a lot more than cats. Light was actually his big thing. But it's once you get past that and he starts describing the earth coming to being, yes, his explanation is God said this and it came to be, but we know the process that it came to be. So you have to say there was something that was set into motion for this to go. And if you say it is with the word, well, we know that it happened from these things that were happening after the supposed Big Bang. Again, Big Bang hypothesis, but the world itself, the earth coming into being, and even the sun, those things we've kind of figured out to a very large degree, measurement errors aside. But the actual process, we figured it out because we see it happening with new worlds. We're able to look at that and say, well, this is something that's similar to what we went through. And let it be as a concept was unique. But I think it was an evolution because the people at this time have figured out that, oh, lightning isn't spontaneous. Oh, floods happen because of weather patterns. Oh, weather patterns happen because of seasons. Seasons happen because of the placement of the sun in how in where we are at this time of year. So they've figured out all these things that were once supernatural. And the more you figured out, the more abstract you had to make it. And that's my biggest argument. Is yes, if you want to go down the road of what we don't know, but we know a lot of this.
So let me on that note, let me go to my last section on Sarna.
Yeah, go into it. Yeah, we keep going.
Because this is directly relating to this is kind of wrapping up the idea of let there be. Um which okay, so again, if you're a nerd, a D&D nerd, or did I ever get you to read start reading the Dresden Files?
I never got into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and you see this
Oh no,
in
excuse me, Dresden Files. Yeah, I read the whole thing.
okay.
For some reason, I was thinking, what's the dark elf? Drizzt?
Yeah.
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 So no, I
Just
never read that. I read the
so
Dresden Files. Yeah.
you see this in various fields. Rumpelstiltskin is there is inherent power in magic words. There are magical words. There are words of power. Especially if you know how to say them precisely. It's not just alakazam. It's you have to know precisely how to say it, and you invoke the power of that word to manipulate the cosmos. All right, so it's important to understand that is a very old idea. So this let there be is being written about in the context of the mystical idea of words of power or magical words. And to quote Sarna, uh, but uh, this refers not to the utterance of the magic word, but to the expression of the omnipotent, sovereign, unchangeable will of the absolute transcendent God, to whom all nature is completely subservient. Such a concept of God and of the process of creation added a new dimension to human thought and marked a new stage in the history of religion. It emancipated the mind from the limitations of the mythopoetic thinking, and it liberated religion from the baneful influence of magic. And this was I never actually got around to answering your question about uh, why isn't this magic? How is this different? Incantation versus invocation. And you kind of sparked my brain there, because my kind of rebuttal to you is you're setting up a heads I win, tails you lose argument that, well, there is a physical component. That's what you said that jogged my brain. Well, of course there's a physical component because we live in a physical world. The creator God is whether directly, shaping like the clay maker, or setting into motion the mechanisms by which this is done. the creator God is speaking into existence a physical world. So yes, there is a physical component, but that doesn't mean it is the same as the attempts of physical manipulation that the magical incantations of the long history of pagan religion it adhered to.
No, this is not the nature of the discussion, though. Is this different than pagan religions? Yes. That was never a point of contention. Is this different in a way that it's more accurate? Well, I'm going to guess if you want to say getting more abstract is more accurate, then correct. But the fact that, again, we have to see, you said heads I win, tails you lose. I think that's the Christian argument in the Berlinski sense. In the, if I can prove God exists, then I win. But if you can't disprove it, then you lose. That's the definition of heads I win, tails you lose.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the argument you're presenting based on even what you said about Berlinski. Is no, yeah, you're arguing is the fact that I can't disprove that the starting to the matter that coalesced into the earth wasn't a supreme being said, let there be, which the after the light, it was, let there be firmament in the midst of the waters and let it divide the waters from the waters. This is from your version here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the next step, which would be a gaseous form becoming a liquid form, becoming a liquid and solid form, which is what happened. Gases coalesce because gas is matter, and space is a vacuum, right? Venus is mostly gas, but it's still a planet. Jupiter is mostly gas, but it's still a planet. Whereas Earth coalesced into gas, liquid, and solid to create something life could be on, right? So verse 6, that is that process. It coalesced into these things, but we know how that came about. If you want to say God said, let there be this, and that started it, I can't argue with that, because it's beyond measurability. It's not evidence.
Right, but I think we're talking past each other here. That's not the point I think Sarna is making.
I think with Genesis 1 through 10, there is no talking past, because you're getting to the edge of everything.
So my point, and the reason I've spent all this time focusing on Sarna's definition of magic and his point that there is no place for it in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is because that is so very different from other religions, which makes it much more rational than other religions. It's not the nonsense that the edgy atheists dismiss it as. There is a very rational process being espoused here.
Rational based on our more modern rationality. Okay, again, we go back to the time period that this came about.
Mm-hmm.
People were living in larger cities. People were coming together. We were a more agricultural society. Things like this person that lives in the woods that puts a hex on you and everything that bad that happens to you is because of that were very easily disproved once everybody got together, because you can see numbers. Okay, so you're in a village of 30 and this one person caused a hex to be on them, and then you start counting every bad thing that happens to this person. We all have negativity bias, and we've gone through the evolutionary reasons for that. So all of a sudden you start proving that this person is casting magic spells, whereas you've got a city with 10,000 people and this person hexes 100 of them, and one of them has something bad happen to them, it has a different effect. So you're no longer able to explain the supernatural in the same way. So now you say, well, that's because this person can't do that, but the supreme being did it before time existed, before we all existed. This is the only word that matters. People's words don't matter. So we've evolved our supernatural sense, and actually we evolved it away from the idea of supernatural. We evolved it to, this all happened before we existed, and go through your life and live the best you can. And then when people started doing that, and this is when we go forward into the rule book parts of it, and people started doing their own thing, then it was, well, we need to tie this thing back in to how you should live. And we get that coming up with Moses here. So there is a process to this. There's a, we can no longer accept the fact that these people can invoke magic just by, you know, speaking their words or doing their ritual. But we still have this supernatural thing because we can't explain everything. And then now we've got to keep a cohesion. So this is the evolutionary process. This existed, it was accepted, it was no longer able to be accepted, so we had to explain it in some other way. But then in that some other way, it took away the cohesion. And then the cohesion had to be brought back together by saying, well, this specific thing says we need to do things this way. So there's the process over the book of Genesis.
The problem with your argument, and maybe this is where we'll leave off and kind of tease what
As
we
long
can
as
get
the
into next time.
as long as the problem isn't an omission thing, because I did try to squeeze it into 5 minutes there.
Yes, no. What you are laying out is a very logical process by which modern religion, Western religion, Judeo-Christian ideas could have evolved. The problem is I see no evidence of that in the historical record.
I see evidence of it in this text.
Right. Just in this text. If what you are postulating is how it happened, not how it could have happened. Hold on.
Okay,
If what you are postulating,
there's a blank that you're missing here, I think.
Okay.
Okay. The blank is laws of man versus laws of the divine. Because the blank you're missing is during that interim between Adam and Eve and Moses was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time, these same people were subjugated to the law, what they called the laws of man, right? And there were tyrants of that time that tried to impose their will. And so it's the difference between universal laws that seem to work for everybody, which I said the 10 commandments are that, except for the first. The first just adds the cohesion to the next 9. These universal truths, basically, to some degree, versus some person at the top trying to impose their will upon a people. And realistically, at the end of the day, and again, fill in those little holes that I tried to condense things down to, it's learning from the mistakes of your predecessors. This is why this tyrant was bad. This is why people rebelled against this person. This is why this person became an elite class and this person became the slave class. All of these if-thens that happened along thousands of years coalesce into 10 commandments, and then it still ends up being kind of perfected after that to some degree, to where we get all the way to where we are with the Constitution, which is, again, another document that's a slight adjustment to those 10 commandments over thousands of years. Everything's a slight adjustment over the course of time. It seems revolutionary because we read it all at once.
No, okay, but I feel like you kind of made the point I was trying to make, which is it it is revolutionary. That was my point in starting with the beginning, is that this concept of of a creation mythos is radical and revolutionary. This concept of not just the creation mythos, but what that means about the God you follow. Even in similar geography, similar culture, where you have one of the few other monotheism, Zoroastrianism, it is still very pagan in its structure. It is still very pagan in its rituals and its magic and all of that Sarna's talking about, even though it's monotheistic. So under what you are postulating, it would be part of this evolution to something more abstract and whatever. And my point was, if what you are postulating is how it came to be, then how come you only see this in this text with a very small ethnic group?
Well, you're conflating my concept of evolution of
Mhm.
religion with the fact that there are multiple evolutions at the same time.
No, I'm not. That's my point. Is if what this text, if the radicalness of this text was simply, to your point, uh a natural progression, a natural evolution of human thought, and it and we're just looking at the snapshot, so it seems, radical, then where are the other texts and traditions similar, not the same, but similar to that? Because surely others would have progressed to the same point, and they don't.
They some did, but differently. And realistically, again, one
No,
of the reasons
who?
Buddhists, it's not a theist religion. I mean, it's not a monotheist or polytheist religion. It's a religion based on a universality, which you can basically break down Christianity to be the unexplained is God, where Buddhists just don't call it God. They just call it the unknown, basically, if you break it down by the end of the day. And yes, there is a transit where you go to a higher place, nirvana,
Transcendence.
transcendence.
Mhm.
Yeah, transition. I can't want to say transition, but transcendence. There's a transcendence, but again, it's based on the fact that there's an ultimate supernatural good that you can achieve. It just looks different. It doesn't say there's something that created everything. It doesn't say it's a god, but it is similar. Similar not being the same, right? Uh that's probably the most obvious one. But again, this becomes easier to do as we go out, which is why the simplistic atheists stick with evangelicals in the Catholic Church. Because the further we go out, the more integrated pagan religions become into this. But go back to one of my original points early on in this discussion. Who's the easiest to convert are downtrodden individuals, right? And you basically use religion as the cure for their state in life. Well, you said one particular people over time. Who's more downtrodden than the ancient Jews? This is their answer to why they transcend, why they should transcend, I should say, the oppression of the Egyptians, for instance. No, the Egyptian religion isn't correct because our God is this. And he's an abstract to reality. He's outside of nature. So that's why he's not in here just blowing up Egyptians right now. But you know what? you keep believing and you can persevere. And that thought is actually very powerful in the psychology of humanity, which we talked about in the very beginning, the first 5 minutes with Big Brain Sapolsky, that all of these things physiologically happen when you believe something like that. Well, it's no surprise that that kind of people would be able to get out of this predicament they're in. And it's actually no surprise that to this day, no matter how fragmented they are, they're still pretty much dominant in all our industries because they have that mentality. But because a certain people has that mentality does not prove that their metaphysical ideology is the source of it. It might be the source of a psychological state to come out of it, but it is not the source of their power. Otherwise, everybody who prescribes to this would have the same power right now. And it would also not prove Christianity, it would prove Judaism, but that's another discussion.
Mm-hmm. So here's why I'm harping on this point. Um, have you ever encountered the edgy atheists who claim that the man Jesus of Nazareth wasn't even a real person?
No, but I typically don't entertain those people.
Mm-hmm. Um, if you don't believe that Jesus of Nazareth, the founder of the Christian church, the originator of the Christian theology was a real person, then you don't believe Alexander the Great existed. Then, you, you don't believe Hannibal existed. That the amount of text that that we have referencing this person far out exceeds that of what we have for these other, ancient, especially when you're talking about Bronze Age figures. You know, you just don't believe in history if you don't
Mhm.
believe that this was a real person who existed. Whatever you think of the theology that came from him, or whatever you think of the supernatural or miraculous things that are attributed to him, if you don't believe he was a real person, then you don't believe in history.
Mhm. And this is why I don't entertain those people, because you can you can tell me all day and give me the evidence of someone who was very intelligent, very influential, and called themselves a prophet all day long, and it still doesn't prove the metaphysics behind what they say,
Hmm.
especially in a day and age when just the basics of CPR or a natural inclination to know the basics of CPR would make you a miracle worker. When we have a saying, saved by the bell, because people used to put bells on their coffins because they couldn't tell if you were dead or just in a coma, and they would bury you alive. So the fact that somebody comes back 3 days after they're quote unquote dead is not something that's actually that big of an outlier. uh so all of these things that are miracles that are attributed, you could factually say they happened, and it still doesn't prove anything. Now, it lends a lot to your case, because obviously over time you have to acknowledge these things, but at the same time it doesn't say this has to be the case. The people that say show me the bones of Jesus and I'll da, 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 da. No, that's you can show me anybody's bones from 2000 years ago and say it's Jesus. We don't have Jesus' DNA on ancestry.com. uh yeah, what do we got, a hair from this instance and then bones from this instance, and we say okay we can prove it's no one's ever going to do that. And if anybody claims they do, they're probably selling you something. uh but to say someone existed, give me historical records. Yes, histories are also pretty skewed. The St. George and the Dragon was probably a crusader that encountered an alligator, if you really break it down, and then came back and told his story. It's history books are very skewed in that way. he described a big giant scaly thing that he killed with a spear and probably brought back a head or a teeth. And we get a story about a dragon out of it. Whereas again, all of these legitimate things can happen, and you still say it's the story of Jesus, and probably pretty legit, but it doesn't mean he cured somebody with supernatural powers. Incantation, by the way.
No, the point is that likewise, so just for the sake of argument, your idea of uh, Jewish tradition representing a natural evolution of human thought, for the sake of argument, let's say that is the case, it is still radical, revolutionary, and different from the rest of the world. Because even if this was not something that was handed down from a higher power, it is still the fact that this does not exist elsewhere. You know, whether contemporary with the rise of the Jewish people, you know, in the Near East in the Bronze Age, or subsequently, even into relatively modern history. One of the reasons Christianity was outlawed and persecuted was because the pagan ideas and rituals and magic was still going on. One of the ways Julius Caesar became emperor was because he created a cult of the emperor very similar to the pharaohs. The emperors proclaimed themselves deities. So Christianity was treason. That's one of the reasons it was outlawed and persecuted, because this pagan idea was still going on, was still propagating, was still growing, you know, even into the relatively modern era.
Well, see, now you're actually invoking Dawkins here, because we're getting into the idea of the meme, right? So just a quick refresher, your genetics are the basically the precursor to everything that makes you up, and then it develops in nature, so that's the nurture over the nature. And then but your phenotype is how that expresses, but then the meme is a genetic expression of ideals. And religion is a great example of a meme. And just because one meme was stronger than the others doesn't mean that the base theory behind the meme is absolutely correct. It just means it's the one that fit the best with the way culture was going at the time. Again, invoking the agricultural society, which the Western world completely embraced. And it's no surprise that it became the predominant meme of the Western and Mesopotamian world, because it embraced agricultural society, which ultimately led to the Enlightenment, which led to all of these other things, which led to Western culture we have now. But you go east, it went differently with East Asian cultures. Now Russian Orthodoxy, it's slightly different. And you go into the progression, and this is again something not accounted for, the progression of theology in the Americas, North and South America, at the exact same time, which would have been about 6,000 BC, with the Asians that became what we call indigenous Americans, which ultimately became the Mayans and the Aztecs, which also started pushing, but they did it more of the Egyptian model, which was polytheistic, but still had that overarching creation theory. And so these things are all similar, but one fit the best. And I've told you why I think it fits the best, because it's the most abstract. It's no surprise that the Egyptian model is almost exactly the same as the Mayan model with different names, right? Because they're in evolution in the agricultural direction, but they stayed polytheistic. Whereas the monotheistic abstract fit the best with technological advancement. So that's why it survived. Survival of the fittest. The meme is an extension, is the ideological version of genetic evolution. And the fact that the meme of Christianity, or excuse me, the meme of Judaism at this level was the one that survived is not proof that it's true. It's proof that it fit the best.
Okay, and I think that's where the hang up is, because you're fixated on saying that this isn't true, and that's not even what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's radical and revolutionary.
Well, again, I think that makes it a red herring argument, because I agreed with it being revolutionary. But I told you why it was revolutionary.
No, this whole time you've been saying, no, it's just a natural evolution of based on, the growth of agriculture.
All revolutions are natural evolutions. They're just the one that won. Standing on 2 feet was revolutionary. And we're the dominant race in the world, or species in the world. Which also makes sense that we would call our religion said we were made in the form of, but we're not to Adam yet. So no, it's revolutionary is, again, we gotta differentiate speaking metaphorically or speaking literally. And this revolution was something that happened over tens of thousands of years, not even 1,000 years, not even, you.
Okay, I think that's the problem, is you're lumping, when you say this revolution, you're lumping all of these traditions together. And I'm saying, no, you can't do that, because the 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 Jewish tradition is separate and unique from all of these other theisms.
No, but it evolved in the same time. It evolved in the same time frame, and it was the dominant version. That's different than saying it's completely different. And again, this is a hang up between evolutionary thinking and Christianity. Humans are a special thing in Judaism and Christianity. We were created in the again, you haven't got there, so if you have a version of this that's different, we'll cross that bridge. But they're created in the
image of God.
The image of God, right? Whereas evolutionary thinking, we kind of evolved alongside all of these other things. And because Homo sapiens succeeded, and Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and all of these other versions didn't, doesn't mean that they weren't all happening at the same time. And it doesn't mean that there was some divine intervention. It means that it was the fittest for how the world was adapting at the time. And culturally, how the world was adapting was towards a more centralized agricultural standard versus a tribal or even solitary existence that was before. So it was the best evolution of many evolutions that were happening. And we see them happening simultaneously across the world. And it was the one that dominated, and it's the one that prevailed.
Except it was the one that prevailed, but it wasn't the one that dominated. That's my point.
Well, eventually, these things take time. It dominated as of the time frame we're in now.
Yeah, but
and okay, so let me put it this way. The reason it's dominated in the time frame we are in now is partly due to the principles that evolved during the time frame that it was under subjugation. Because again, you were being dominated by other cultures at the time. So necessity is the mother of invention. War is the father of innovation. And barbecue is superior to bland sirloin steak because people had to adapt under harsh conditions. The more harsh conditions you have to adapt under, the better product you end up pushing out the other side. Again, this culture that was being subjugated had their own meme developing, but it was developed under the spear and fire versus the meme that was developing under comfort. Why do you think we're collapsing right now? Because we're in the moment of comfort as the United States of America. The meme that develops on the underside of that is going to be the one that survives. It's a natural evolution of life, because the United States colonies, before they were the United States, developed under the comfort of the English Empire, which the sun never set on at the time.
If it is such a natural evolution, then why are there not more groups like the Jews?
There are similar groups.
That persisted in subjugation and persecution for 5,000 years?
I'm sure if we got into Eastern history, yeah, we could figure some of those out. The Americas was different because the dominant religions were the ones that were in power at the exact same time that the Judeo-Christian Western culture came over with their already advanced technologies. So that skews the data. We don't know if a slave culture would have come out of that time. Everything that happened, well, here's an advantage to it. Everything that happened in Mesopotamia had a head start on most of the rest of the world. It was the first area to become agricultural. Everything else expanded from there, which is why people call it the Holy Land. Even though first man came from Africa, the first civilizations as a non-tribal entity came from the Mesopotamian area, probably because of the geographical plenty that was there at the time. Everything changed after the flood, which again was a historical event and is not proof of anything. We will go into that because I have all the time frames and everything for that. But things changed after those weather events, but that was a place of plenty. It was between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It was basically the start of agriculture as a civilizationary concept was right there. And then that meme itself expressed out from there. And then people went their different ways, and we have one group that was subjugated to basically harsh, I don't know, let's say treatment, but harsh development. We don't know if that would have happened in the Americas because that time frame was delayed. Because remember, that expanded out to Asia, and then it expanded over the Bering Strait, expanded down the Americas to where you could get to an area, which was on a latitude with the Mesopotamian area, and then became civilized cultures, civilized in their own sense, right? And again, we don't know if the progression would have been the same, if it would have been dominant, because before that could happen, a technologically advanced group of people came over and basically blew them up and made them very sick with smallpox. A lot of things have to be accounted for that I don't think are accounted for in this argument, and those are a lot of them. That's just the tip of the iceberg with it, because we have multiple things developing at the same time, And just to say, one of the arguments against a lot of things historically is the winners write the history books. Well, yeah, the civilization that had the head start, that had the expansion, is
That's
the
my
one.
point, though. The Jews weren't the winners ever.
Christians were, though.
No, that doesn't matter. Set that aside, because the the text of the Old Testament, the Torah, remains the same through those 5,000 years of never being the
Yeah,
winners.
but it's the basis for Christianity. It's an evolution of Christianity, and I'm waiting till we get to that to actually go into how it's really the evolution of it. But without the Old Testament, you can't have the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that the Jews that won't let go of the Old Testament are the winners is wrong. Yeah, you're correct. But what was created from the meme that is Genesis and beyond is what ultimately took over most of the what we call the Western world.
Yes. And that was only because the meme, as you put it, persisted in a very small ethnic group even after their national polity was crushed and they as a people were spread to the four corners of the known world. And yet it persisted. And the
Well,
point I'm trying to
a
make is
strong
that
idea will persist, and
yes,
then
yes,
some group that has figured, actually multiple groups, and this is actually another spin-off here, a group that can take the principles of the strong idea and adapt it to where it's no longer the exception to the rule, is going to thrive. And we have two great examples of this. We have Christianity and the expanse of the Holy Roman Empire, and then eventually the movements after that, which built on that. And actually, they were a regression for progression to some degree. The Protestant movement was taking non-Christian beliefs from the Roman Catholic Church. So it was a regression. And then it progressed from there to become a lot of other things. But you got Islam. Islam doesn't exist without the Old Testament as well. So if you combine those two things plus the original Jews, you have a world force.
you have a world force in the very modern era.
Yeah, exactly.
Until then, though, it was a very unique, very different and separate and small change in theology.
But something that worked very well with the trend of culture.
Yes,
Why did
but
the Egyptians collapse?
a couple of
Ultimately,
factors.
but yeah, a couple of factors, but ultimately, why did the Egyptians collapse?
Uh,
Because the Pharaoh was not a god.
a combination of outside pressures and climate shifts.
Yeah. But because the Pharaoh was not a god was the ultimate part of that. Because if he was a god, there would be no climate shifts.
Mm-hmm.
If he was a god, there would be no outside pressures. If he was a god, then he would have had eventually more influence over his own people than he did during these events.
Well, it almost sounds like you're making my argument that, or
No, I'm
I'm not even
making
making the argument, but making an argument of the divine nature of Jewish tradition.
no, it's not divine nature, it's the superior nature. There's a difference. There is no divine nature in humanity, but we're the number one species in the world. Elephants will never take over the world.
because they don't have thumbs.
Although they're really good with their trunks.
True.
Dolphins will never take over the world,
They definitely don't have
but
thumbs.
it doesn't make us divine. And
Yeah, which again, the whole point I was been trying to make this entire time, and even in previous episodes, is set aside the divine argument. It is still unique and radical, and to my knowledge, no other tradition created something like this. Every other tradition to evolve was the pagan ideas the way Sarna describes them. Everyone, all the way up into the cult of the emperors in the first few centuries AD.
But I described another one, which was Buddhism.
And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because I don't know Buddhism well enough to.
But you don't have to know that it doesn't have a nature God type dynamic. It celebrates nature while knowing something is beyond that, right? But at the same time, so it again, it's different. It's different than pagan religions. So just the fact that it's different from pagan religions doesn't mean it's right. And the other part of it is, again, being superior. The argument is the divine, but because being the thing that fits the best doesn't make it 100% correct. And the part that's not correct is the part that makes it's the most important part of the whole thing. What is the basis of it? Because we can take the principles of something and not attach a divine and get a completely different argument out of it.
My head hurts.
That's my job.
Yeah.
No, this is how these talks should go, though.
Yeah.
Only usually with a cigar and a campfire too, but
that would be nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little nicotine buzz might help my head. Well, I think we've flagellated this deceased equine thoroughly. And we can just keep going around in circles, but the couple of people that started watching us have long since left, so we might as well just wrap it up here and try
I don't know.
again
I
next
think this
time.
kind of discussion would actually get a bigger audience than a lot of the other things we talk about. So I'll try to name the episode appropriately and come up with a good inflammatory meme. It has nothing to do with the big pharma companies, so it shouldn't be taken down. But
shouldn't. We'll see.
Theoretically. But yeah, it was a good 2 hours on Let There Be. We'll get into Adam and Eve next time and the Garden of Eden. All right. Well, anything else?
That's all I got.
All right. We'll see you next time.